Welcome everyone. My name is Chuck Hannaford, and I'm a retired archaeologist with the Center of New Mexico Archaeology's Office of Archaeological Studies, the OAS, and I'm also a member of the OAS education team. And the intent of our education team is to present some of the fascinating observations that we've been able to learn from the artifacts of New Mexico's heritage. So today I would like to talk about historic archaeology. And when people think about archaeology, they often think about deep antiquity, study of Native Americans, maybe going back to the Clovis period in New Mexico 12,000 years ago. But actually, archaeology is a discipline that comes all the way down from the beginning and the genesis of artifacts maybe 3.2 million years ago, down to modern times. So the historic period is the period of the overlap of written documents with the archaeological record. They become intertwined together. And the historic period in New Mexico begins in 1540 with the coming of Coronado and the meeting of the indigenous peoples of New Mexico with the Western civilizations of Europe, down to the colonization of New Mexico in 1598. The founding of Santa Fe in 1610. Documents may even suggest as early as 1605. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Mexican period of 1821, the territorial period beginning in 1846, and down to the statehood period beginning in 1912. And so the historic archaeology has both artifacts and written documents that allow us to study the past. So let's begin to talk about historic archaeology. When the Spanish come into New Mexico in 1540, one of the diagnostic or representative artifacts that they bring with them is metal. So we begin to see things like this showing up. The Native Americans of New Mexico had copper bells that they were getting from trade from Mexico, but they didn't really have any metal artifacts. So we're also getting closer in time so we can begin to identify what some of these artifacts are. So I can show you this, and you know that it's a horseshoe. In fact, this is a big workhorse. This is a big sort of Clydesdale size workhorse that may have been used in Santa Fe maybe around the 1880s to carry wagon loads of goods from the railroad out to the marketplaces. We can compare this big workhorse with a Civil War period cavalry horse, and you can see the difference in size. And then we can compare those two with this. This is a little bit harder. Compare it with a horse. This is a mule shoe. It's more of a U-shaped artifact. And then these are some of my favorite. These are a little more difficult because we just don't really see this around today. There's two of them. Anybody know what these are? We don't see these around today that much, but these are oxen shoes. And the Spanish used oxen to haul the ox carts up from Mexico City to New Mexico. And if you're using these animals for draft purposes, you need to protect their feet. So the oxen has a cloven hoof, and so instead of being just one shoe, you have to have two. So in the Camino Real, these are artifacts that you might find. You very seldom find a whole ox shoe. Usually you find a fragment, the tip, the back end. So it's an artifact that it's interesting to know and keep your eye out for. One of my favorite artifacts that shows up with the Spanish is this artifact. In Spanish, this is called a chispa, a sparker. And this was the Spanish artifact for making fire, the quest for fire. So you can imagine a long day on the Camino Real. It's the end of the day, you're tired, you want to get a fire started. This is what you made your fire with. And you would probably have a pouch with some sort of dry combustible material, cattail down, something that can catch this spark. And then it's a matter of sparking. That's where it gets its Spanish name of chispa. It's fairly easy to make these sparks. The next step is to get that spark to catch and make a fire. So you can imagine a cold winter day. It's windy, your hands are cold, and this is your fire maker. An interesting, I like the way an artifact in one culture can be a different kind of artifact in another. So the Plains Indians especially would be watching the covered wagons coming across the west, and they had water barrels. So to the settlers, it was a barrel for containing water and various food. To the Native Americans, it was a source for metal, the highly prized metal. So they didn't want the barrel, they wanted the barrel hoop. And they would actually take these barrel hoops and cut them into little rectangular strips that could then be traded throughout the plains area down into New Mexico. And from these, they were able to make metal points, arrow points. So you can look at these points, have a metal point and a stone point. Actually, the stone point is probably sharpest, but it's brittle. Chances are every time you shoot your arrow and it hits the ground, it's going to snap. The metal point is much more forgiving. It gives you multiple shots. So when Lewis and Clark are up in Idaho in 1804 in their exploration of the Louisiana Purchase, they record in their diaries that already in these remote parts of the upper North America, they estimate that over half of the arrow points are already being made out of metal. So it's just expanding out that fast. If we were to go down on the plaza of New Mexico and put in a 1 by 1 meter test pit, this is the sort of artifacts that we would look at. We'd be getting probably a good meter of midden, all the everyday charcoal, ash, broken dishes, animal bone that are being eaten, that's accumulated since the founding of Santa Fe in 1610, coming up to now. I always thought this was an interesting curiosity. This is a sheep bone that was introduced by the Spanish. When the Spanish come into New Mexico, they bring a wide range of new animals with them: horses, cows, pigs, sheep. And so this is a sheep bone. It's been butchered with an axe. It has axe scarring on it. And this is a root of a downtown tree that happened to grow through this midden and just happened to fortuitously grow around this sheep bone. So this is one of those interesting curiosities. A lot of the artifacts that we use in our education are unprovenience artifacts from utility trenches and various things where their location has been lost, and so a lot of their scientific value is no longer valid, but they're great examples for learning and doing educational programs. If you look at the sherds, they're very Native American looking. But if you begin to look closer, you begin to see little differences. This is a good example. This is a piece of pottery that was made by Native Americans for trade to the Spanish. So it's a Native American vessel, but it's got some unique European attributes to it. So it's got this really nice ring base. You see this on a number of different types of pottery. So these are Native American vessels being made for trade to the Spanish. So you begin to get new types of vessels like candlesticks. This is one of my favorites, actually. This is a soup bowl. So this is a soup bowl made by Native Americans for the Spanish. It's got a deep bowl with a nice rim around it. So you start getting these different vessel forms. If you're away from downtown Santa Fe and you're looking at a rural Spanish homestead, it can look very much like a Native American site. Usually what you'll see is a low mound of the adobe melt from a house surrounded by a wide range of ceramics, most of which are Native American looking. But then if you're lucky, you might get little things like this, little fragments of Mayolica. And these are Spanish vessels that are being brought up on the Camino Real. It's like a good 6-month journey. These are being manufactured in both Mexico City and Puebla, as well as Spain and Italy and France, and being brought all the way up. So if we find even small fragments of this on a site, it gives us the indication that the Spanish family that lived there may have had a higher status, and they could afford to have something like this that has traveled all the way up into New Mexico. We also get big vessels like this. These are called olive jars, very distinctive. You can see how the glaze jumps out at you when you're looking at the ceramics. These were big sort of amphora containers for olives, olive oil, and other goods that are being transported up on the Camino Real. We might get something like this. One of the animals, like we were saying, that came in with the Spanish is sheep. So wool replaced the cotton. Native Americans grew cotton. They did weaving of various dress and tapestries. It was early replaced by the wool. And so this is a spindle whorl. Would have had a stick that went through the middle of it and allowed you to spin it. And you would have a glob of wool and it in, and as you spun it, it would pull that thread in and make your yarn. Another interesting, I always thought this was an interesting story of who this was. This is a Spanish colonial button made out of a micaceous potsherd. And you have to think that, especially in the colonial period, early colonization of New Mexico, they were just remote from what they were used to seeing. So if you lost a button, you may have to manufacture that. So I always wondered who this person was that made this button out of a micaceous sherd from downtown Santa Fe. Another thing we see is, well, I should show you this. You know, we very seldom see whole bowls of Mallorca, but that gives you the idea of what they look like. As archaeologists, what we are seeing is that little chip. But this gives you an idea of what Mallorca looks like. It's actually a tinware glaze that really jumps out at you when you compare it to the Native American pottery. We also begin to get things like mica and gypsum crystals. And these were used for glass. The Spanish colonial, or the Spanish colonists, didn't have windows, and so they had to adapt from resources on the local environment. And two of those resources were mica and gypsum. And they would take these gypsum crystals, which can be very transparent, and they would shape these into little squares that they would then make windows out of. And you can actually see, I think there's a mica window at Acoma that's still there. So we're sort of coming down through time, coming down into the opening of the Santa Fe Trail in 1820. New Mexico is connected up in the east side of the United States, and you start getting goods coming in from both the east on the Camino Real, or on the Santa Fe Trail, and from the south on the Camino Real. So we're beginning to get a whole new range of artifacts showing up, beginning with the opening up of the Santa Fe Trail. Start getting crockery, and you can see how different it's looking from the Spanish and the Native American. The ironstone ceramics that we may have in our houses today, very distinctive, various forms of jugs. And then you start getting glass and metal. One of the interesting artifacts that comes in on the Santa Fe Trail are tin cans. And so if you're out hiking and you come across a can, you want to watch for the soldered circle and dot on the bottom of the can. This is another good example of it. And these are the grandfather of our modern tin cans. Our modern tin cans just have a flat bottom. They're called sanitary cans. And this is an example of a sanitary can top that actually has the word sanitary inscribed on it. So these cans actually go back to the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon offered a prize for anybody that could come up with a container that would preserve food for his troops. And a doctor came up with a tin can. And it was a container of metal with all the seams soldered with lead glaze. And so you would put the contents of the can through the circle, solder on the circle, and then steam this. And once you got a steam vent coming out of the last little circle, you put a drop of solder on there, formed a vacuum, and preserved the contents of the can. And so that opened up being able to preserve and transport a wide range of food things. You didn't have a can opener, so you would take a knife, make an X, fold them back, or in this case, they've just cut the entire top of the can off. In some cases, we can see the contents of the cans, like the classic baking powder can, the classic lard can, tobacco cans. I've often been amazed on how old sardine cans are, especially in the dry Southwest. You still get a lot of sardine cans, but it's all soldered seams. So the food is preserved, but it's preserved in lead solder. So it's sort of got a poison content to it. So sometimes you'll find camps like cowboy camps where you'll get the whole range of making food, making biscuits, smoking a cigarette, and then often having alcohol at the end of it. With the opening of the I've always found that this was an interesting artifact. This is a stopwatch that a friend gave me from Union County, where the Santa Fe Trail came into New Mexico. And this is a stopwatch that was lost on the trail. It dates to 1876. It's got inscribed on the anniversary of the American Revolution. So this is, again, just one of those interesting curiosities. I've also found it very curious that the pocket for the stopwatch is still with us. And I'm not quite sure why this has been retained through time, but you can see how it's the same size for the stopwatch. They're really not used for much anymore. I seem to find that my pocket ends up being the place that I keep stuff that I come across, like this Permian trilobite. So cartridges. You start getting, instead of bows and arrows, you start getting guns. So you get the classic 44 and 45 Colt. You get both rim fire and center fire cartridges that have different combustion technology. So we can actually, if you have a rim fire, it's slightly earlier than the center fire. Get 45-70 military carbines. These are the same carbines that the soldiers at the Little Bighorn were using. In New Mexico, again, you get this secondary use of these. And the Athabascan and the Apache, Navajo, like these for making tweezers. And so they would take these cartridges and make a little slit down each end that they would then make tweezers out of, and this is what they would shave with. Glass. You start getting a wide range of glass showing up. A lot of the early glass is both a dark brown color and an aqua color. And people wanted clear glass so they could see what was inside the bottle. So glass manufacturers found that they could put a mineral called manganese into the glass formula, and it would change the color of this to clear. And so the people could then see what was inside the bottle, like this early aspirin bottle. But what's interesting is that when the glass is exposed to sunlight, after a certain period of time, and I've never done the experiment to see how long it takes, but the clear bottle will become purple. And again, it's a very diagnostic artifact for archaeologists. When archaeologists are out on the landscape, they're always surveying for the different kinds of artifacts, and they're always looking to see what time period they are in. So the purple glass is very diagnostic for a period of around 1880 to 1920. This is a purple bottle, but it was buried. And so if we were to take this clear bottle and expose it to the sunlight in the window, at some point to transform into a purple bottle. And then we can begin to look at the technology of the bottle for helping us to date it. So if we look at this early medicine bottle, they could make the entire bottom of the bottle in a machine. So again, we can use manufacturing scars to help us date the bottle. They could make the entire bottom of this bottle in a machine. And so you can see the seam of the mold coming up to the neck. But they had to make the finish or the closure of the bottle by hand, so it would obliterate that seam. So if you're out in the field and you find an old bottle, one of the first things you're looking for is to see if the seam stops on the neck or whether the seam comes up all the way over and through the rim. If you look at a modern Coke bottle, you'll see that they can make the entire bottle in a machine, and so the seam goes all the way up and over. So you're looking at the seam, looking at the closure. And so the early bottles had cork closures that stop about 1920 and are then replaced by our classic screw-on cap. Sometimes the shape of the bottle can give you an indication of what was in like an early ink bottle. Beer bottles. There was a time in the 1880s when Santa Fe manufactured its own beer. And there used to be a brewery about 3/4 of a mile up Palace Avenue near the La Vereda. And they used the water from the Santa Fe River in the 1880s to manufacture their own beer. This is a quart beer bottle from the Fisher Brewery from that time period. And then there was also an associated terrace bar. And this is where a lot of the folks went on Friday nights. You can go through Adolf Bandelier's journals, and he'll often be discussing how he was at the terrace bar with Charles Lummis and other dignitaries of Santa Fe drinking beer. And it's often interesting that he'll record in his diary or his journal the next day that, I wanted to go to the archives, but I feel terrible after being at the brewery yesterday. So they were making beer. What finally collapsed the local Santa Fe beer industry was the putting into the reservoirs in Santa Fe in 1890, and it dried up their water supply. In addition to the beer, they're also making mineral water. So these mineral water bottles, this actually has Santa Fe, New Mexico inscribed on it, are very heavy. They've got these very distinctive blob tops. The glass is heavy to withstand the pressure of the mineralization of the bottle. They had these interesting stoppers called Hutchinson stoppers that had a rubber gasket on the inside and extended about a half an inch out on the outside. The pressure of the gas, or the gas from the mineral water, would keep that rubber gasket pushed up against the neck and keep the bottle closed. And so to open it, you would hold it by its neck and pop that down. And that's where the word pop bottle got its origin. And they would often drink it just as mineral water, or you would mix that with flavors, and that's where soft drinks sort of got their origin from. In 1880, the railroad comes into New Mexico and replaces or brings the end to the Santa Fe Trail. And the coming of the railroad, here's a classic road spike from that time period, again opens up New Mexico to just a wide range of goods. Actually, you can come all the way down in the 1950s. This is an interesting article. This is a Navajo peyote rattle. And as I was a kid in the 50s, we actually had these same salt and pepper shakers. So I had the privilege of being able to be given this one time. And it's sort of a memento in my own life of those salt and pepper shakers from the 1950s. As we're coming down through time, New Mexico goes from one of the earliest sites, two of the earliest sites, the Clovis and the Folsom site, representing some of the early antiquity, all the way down to the detonation site of the atomic bomb. So having grown up in Los Alamos, my dad was a scientist up there. I can appreciate that whole study that went on in the 40s of cracking the atom. So this is an interesting artifact from that time period. And this is trinitite from the detonation of the first atomic bomb. The heat of the bomb actually melted the sand into this sort of greenish glass. And a lot of the scientists from the period were able to be given samples of this. So this is some samples of trinitite that my dad had received. The Trinity site is LA 100,000. Every archaeological site gets an LA number that stands for Laboratory of Anthropology. So the detonation site of the first atomic bomb, where the atom was first cracked here in New Mexico, is LA 100,000. And with that, we're sort of getting back to this bad boy. And I like to view this as sort of the Mad Max, what they call the pox eclipse in the Mad Max movies. This is a spearhead that was by a Basque friend of mine who was an expert flint knapper. And it's a spearhead sort of representing that post-apocalypse period that we might see in our science fiction. And this is made out of a refrigerator tray. And so this is a glass spearhead from that period. If you ever watch the movie of Beyond Thunderdome, there's this great talk between Savannah and First Tracker where they're telling the story of their band to the young ones. And I've always admired this story that Savannah tells. And she's saying, this ain't one body's tell. It's the story of us all. We got it mouth to mouth. You got to listen it and remember, 'cause what you hears today, you got to tell the birth tomorrow. I'm looking behind us now, across the count of time, down the long hall, into history back. So archaeology is also a trail that we can follow down that long hall into history back, from our modern era back to the first stone tools that go back like 3.2 million years ago, and then material culture vanishes. So as you're out in the wilds, keep your eyes focused on the ground for those remnants of the past that you might come across, and then keep in the back of your head the wonders of archaeology. See you in the field, and by the way, happy Earth Day. So these are oxen shoes from the Spanish colonial period. It's a good diagnostic or representative artifact to know about. This is a native gypsum and mica that the Spanish colonists used to make windows out of it, since they didn't have access to actual window glass. The chispa, making sparks for fire. This is a Mayolica bowl that's being brought up from Mexico City and Pueblo, possibly even across from Spain, and is one of the Spanish colonial vessels that's being brought in. Archaeologically, what we see are tiny fragments. But those who know, like maybe Dean Wilson, can look at these and they can look at one of these tiny little fragments and tell you how old it is and where it came from. And it gives us a lot of information on Spanish sites. This is a Spanish colonial soup bowl. It's one of my favorite vessel forms. It's being made by Native Americans, but it's a unique European form for the Spanish colonists. You also see this in the form of ring bases, where it's a native pottery, but unique Spanish vessel forms. This is a Spanish colonial button made out of a micaceous jar fragment. And then spindle whorls, artifacts that were often made out of potsherds to enable people to spin wool into yarn. This is part of a big olive jar, sort of an amphora-shaped vessel for transporting goods along the Camino Real. This is a vessel form from the Los Alamos Ranch School, And we know that because of the unique maker's mark or symbol of the ranch. And so this is one of the dinnerwares that the ranch school would have been using. So this is a mineral water bottle from the Santa Fe, dates back to about the 1880s. It's very heavy glass, blob top. And this is the unique Hutchinson stopper that dates back to about 1879. And you would hold that by the neck and pop that. And that's where the word pop originated from.